Good morning. So nice to see all of you up here early on a Saturday morning. Give yourself a round of applause for getting up and out here to Page Hall. Thank you very much and welcome. I'm Paul Grandal, the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. We're very proud to present this symposium this weekend, Telling the Truth in a Post-Truth World. A few housekeeping rules. The last 20 minutes or so of this panel will be open for audience questions. Once again, we need a reminder that these are questions. I'm going to make it like Twitter, 140 characters or less, or you'll be cut off. Because we had 5-10 people that didn't get ask their questions because one or two people monopolized with a 5-10 minute monologue. So if you have a question, we want to hear your questions, but we want to hear as many questions as possible. Secondly, this is all being recorded, live streamed. Yesterday we had people watching from as far away as California, and it's being archived. You'll be able to watch it later. All of your questions will be part of the archival record of this symposium. I also want to remind you, if you're coming back to later sessions, we're doing a community outreach. We're partnering with Grassroots Givers, a nonprofit organization here in Albany. We're asking you to bring in used children's books. They have a program this whole school year. 625 at-risk, in-need school children in Albany are getting a backpack every Friday with some food, with some supplies, and a book. These are kindergartners through middle schoolers. Many of them come from households where there are no books. It would be wonderful if some of you brought books. They're out in the lobby. I see that there is boxes of books. It's growing. It would be great to contribute to that. After this panel, our panelists will be happy to sign books. There are books for sale. Our university bookstore is out in the lobby, also with the books for sale, and panelists said they will be happy to sign books afterwards. So let me thank our wonderful sponsors for helping to support this event. It takes a lot of people. This was a real team effort. Different departments, organizations in the university, and incredible staff at the Writers Institute. Please thank the staff of the Writers Institute who are wearing the yellow lanyards along with our wonderful volunteers as well. So these are our premier sponsors: the Times Union, the Craig Newmark Philanthropic Fund, our presenting sponsors, BN Communications, and Renaissance Corporation of Albany in memory of John C. Egan. Our other sponsors include Albany Public Library Foundation, Center for Law and Justice, Foundation for Information, Resources, Science, and Technology, Hodgson Russ LLP, M&T Bank, St. Peter's Health Partners, the Law, Youth, and Citizenship Program of the New York State Bar Association, UHY LLP, Pernilla Dake, Paul Grandal, and William Kennedy. Also, the Bernard F. Connors Foundation, Foy Foundation Advised Fund, Catherine Gibson, Margaret and Jonathan Harvey, and the New York Newspapers Foundation. Thank you. Now, this is the third panel on the second day, and this morning's panel is titled Dirty Deeds, Election Mischief, Cybercrimes, and Civil Liberties. And let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Russell Banks is a best-selling novelist and the author of numerous acclaimed novels, including Continental Drift, Affliction, and Cloud Splitter. He's also a past president of the International Parliament of Writers and founder and president of Cities of Refuge, North America. Please welcome Russell Banks. David Daley is a digital media fellow at the Grady School of Journalism at the University of Georgia, former editor-in-chief of Salon.com, and the author of Ratf, The True Story Behind the Secret Plan to Steal America's Democracy. Please welcome David Daley. James Steiner is a professor and program coordinator for Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Emergency Management at the University at Albany's Rockefeller College. He received the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal for his service in the CIA, which included 20 years covering Soviet defense. Please welcome James Steiner. Kelley Vlahos is executive editor of the American Conservative magazine, a longtime political writer for FoxNews.com, and a journalist who specializes in covering national security, war policy, and America's military-industrial complex. Please welcome Kelley Vlahos. And our moderator, Victor Asal. He's a professor of political science and chair of the Department of Public Administration at the University at Albany, and a widely quoted expert on terrorism, homeland security, and political violence and oppression. Please welcome Victor Asal.
Welcome, everybody. So I'm just going to take a moment to get my notes here so I don't get anything horribly wrong. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, who aren't here anymore, and the panelists. I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. There is that old phrase, we live in interesting times. We live in very interesting times, and we're going to talk about that. And I had a long introduction, but I think I'm going to cut it fairly short and mention a couple of things that make our times more interesting. I don't know if anyone noticed that yesterday there was an announcement that over $20 million was given to one of the organizers of the Trump campaign in 2016. That in the last several weeks, Facebook and Google and Twitter are coming out with information about a lot of troll bots and advertisements being bought with Russian money, that there is an ongoing investigation of the campaign in terms of the influence of the Russian government. In addition, we have the current issue of ongoing challenges of what's being called fake news. And we also have, from a more domestic side of things, as well as something that's been going on for quite a while, which is the gerrymandering of American politics. I teach an introductory class of comparative politics to a whole lot of students, and I see America as one country to compare to other countries. And when I show my students a picture of a gerrymandered counties in the United States, students will always raise their hand and say, "Really, Professor Asal?" And I will say, "Yes, really." And so we have a lot of issues related to the topic of this discussion. And I want to start with a very, very basic question to our panelists. How did we get here?
Oh, am I expected to begin?
Whoever wants to jump on the grenade can jump on the grenade.
Right. Well, in a sense, I suppose we have always been here. But let me just begin by pointing out my colleagues here are all experts, in a sense, in very precise and specific ways, and I'm just a storyteller, which means almost by definition that I'm an expert on nothing. And so my contributions to this discussion might be coming in from the side rather than directly approaching the questions and the topics. But yeah, how did we get here? And as we were speaking a little bit earlier, I was thinking about it. began to remember, of course, that American elections have always been fixed in some way or other, that from the very beginning all the way up through, and some of the most famous ones, of course, are Kennedy's election and the fixing of it in West Virginia and Cooks County, Illinois, and so forth. This is a grand American tradition, the fixing of our elections, due to the peculiarities, I suppose, of our constitutional arrangements and our electoral college, and so such as we've recently seen. You can win the popular vote and still lose the election. So it doesn't take much to tip it one way or the other. So in that general sense, I suppose we've always been here. What seems to me enormous change is the technology of control, of manipulation of the election, and that's it may have been going on before this election, but we suddenly became fully aware of it in this current election. So I look forward. I think my mic just. Are we okay? I'm on again. Yeah. So I look forward to hearing what my colleagues up here have to say with regard to now.
I think how did we get here is a really crucial question, and I would say that if our democracy was a horror show, and increasingly it does in fact resemble one, that the call is coming from inside the house, folks. We are a closely divided country. We are almost an equally divided country, and yet all of the political power, both in Washington and in our state capitals, is held by one party. Republicans control not only all of Washington, but 69 of 99 state capitals, legislative chambers in these capitals. They have a modern record of 34 governors. They have both chambers in 35 states, both chambers and the governor in half of the country. And the question of how this happened, to me, goes back to a specific Republican strategy after the Democratic sweep in 2008, after Barack Obama is elected, after Democrats take a supermajority in the US Senate, after Democrats renew their majority in the US House. If you go back and look at the TV coverage that night, there's a big celebration in Chicago's Grant Park. You have the smartest political minds in both parties on every network talking about how the Republican Party is about to become the minority party in this country for a generation. Didn't exactly happen that way, did it? And Republicans plotted their way back through redistricting. That they used the oldest trick in the book, the gerrymander, the dark art of drawing district lines in such a way as to give yourself a partisan edge while minimizing the voice and the reach and the impact of your opponents in an altogether audacious and new way. The gerrymander goes back to the beginning of the country. As long as there have been politicians, they have tried to draw districts that do themselves a favor. But we've never seen the combination of deep political intent on one side and then the big technology and data that makes it possible to draw district lines that then do not flip for a decade, perhaps. I wrote this book because I fundamentally did not understand why Democrats won 1.4 million more votes for the US House in 2012, but Republicans held on to a 234-201 majority. And if that happens again in 2018, if Democrats take more votes but fail to retake the chamber, something really amazing will have happened in our politics. You will have the White House, the Senate, and also the US House under the control of the party that got fewer votes. And that seems to me to be a pretty dangerous situation for a democracy to be in, and something that all of us, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, communists, atheists, what have you, ought to be able to agree that something is devastatingly wrong with a system that can be intentionally warped to make it staggeringly difficult for the side with the most votes to actually control the country?
Well, I'm the intelligence guy here today. So my role is to essentially be Vladimir Putin. And as Vladimir, I want to disagree with you. I am very happy with the way things have developed in the U.S. over the last 20 years. You're meeting my agenda, and at the right point, I will tell you exactly what my agenda is. But at this point, I just want to kind of set the stage from my perspective. And that is that, you know, I don't like you guys. I don't like you guys at all. The biggest catastrophe of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then you humbled my country. You let NATO expand. And you're so pompous. You're full of yourself, this beautiful democracy you have. So my job is to throw whatever monkey wrench into your machinery I can. And, you know, I've tried this for decades. By the way, I'm a career KGB officer. That's the truth, by the way, in case you forget that. You can look in my eyes and you can see whatever I want you to see in my eyes. I've been... I can see Russia from my house. Yeah, there you go. You know, and normally I can't have a big impact on what's going on domestically. But I try and I try and I try. But this year, with the changes in technology, with the way you've prepared the groundwork for me, I've been in my own. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later on. But the bottom line, folks, is I'm the only one who's not an American. I'm the one outside the country taking advantage of everything you heard about last night and tonight. Did I have an impact? Well, we may never know, but I can tell you this much. If the vote was 40 to 60%, if the vote was 40 to 60%, blah, blah, blah. If the vote was 40 to 60%, I wouldn't be sitting up here today. But this vote was so close that even with everything else that was going on domestically, my intelligence officers are telling me we had a decisive effect.
Well, I'm sitting here trying to decide whether I should play Hillary Clinton right now or riff off of what David had said, and I think I'm going to choose Dave for now. I totally, agree with the divide in this country has created the groundwork for what we see today, and as Dave has so eloquently explained, the gerrymandering process and how that's created the electoral differences we see today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the corporate media and how it is created the conditions for what we're seeing today. Last night, as I was sitting here in the panel, I did a little Google exercise to see how many media conglomerates own the media today, what we see. There's all of 12. 12 major corporations in this world control the media, serving as gatekeepers for what we see, whether it be on traditional media, whether it be television, radio, cable news, or the Facebook, Google, Twitter, and all of the online holdings. So we're talking major players like Comcast, Time Warner, AT&T, Facebook, 21st Century Fox. There's only 12. And across all of this, what do they all have in common? They need to make money, they want to make money, they want to grow, they want to influence, they want to gather power because power is money and money is power. And so it is in their best interest that they keep this entrenched two-party dichotomy going. And right now, the narrative that has been created and has been perpetuated by these 12 media conglomerates is the simple, did the Russians meddle in our elections? Why, and were they successful? And so the two-party system as it's set up, you have the Democrats who are saying that the Russians stole the elections for Donald Trump. He is not a legitimate president. You have the other side saying, not so fast, the Russians had no influence and you just want to explain away Hillary Clinton's losses. As long as that narrative prevails, that's all we talk about. And this substantiates, the goals and the mission of these 12 conglomerates and the prevailing media establishment. I think as Americans and as media consumers, we need to keep an open mind and keep our skeptical natures in gear and see whose best interest this narrative is serving. Step back, look at the evidence of the meddling, look at the whose best interest does it serve to have it be true, whose best interest is it serving to it be false, and then decide for us ourselves by being our own investigators as to what is true. I think all of us in this room remember the run-up to the Iraq War, 2002 after 9/11, and how the big media conglomerates, the establishment, corporate media, had convinced this country that we needed to go to war against Saddam Hussein. And they used false intelligence peddled to them directly by Washington to get this narrative through. And we were all duped. Well, not all of us. I think there are a lot of us in this room who were sounding the alarms back then. But we were overshadowed and outmanned, so to speak, in terms of our skepticism. And I don't think we should let that happen again, ever. And so I try to be the voice of reason in terms of I don't believe either way until I see more evidence of what's been peddled, but I always keep in mind whose best interest, and of course, follow the money.
Okay, so I have just two random thoughts. One is that Jim Steiner is on my floor. He's a colleague of mine, and now I'm really, really nervous. The other is, as you were talking about a narrow number of conglomerates, I was thinking about the air industry and the joys that flying is today and how it's getting better and better every day as we fly. And it sounds, Kelley, like you're making a similar kind of argument about the joys of watching and reading. So we're going to go into some more specifics here. So for the panelists, if there's something you feel like commenting on, that's great. And if not, that's fine too. What is gerrymandering really? And why is it such a problem? Right? I mean, people get to vote. Their vote counts. Why is gerrymandering such a big deal?
Gerrymandering has always been a lethal partisan weapon, but the data, the technology, and the ease and certainty with which that data can be manipulated by partisan map makers to draw these lines is more decisive and durable than ever. You can trace gerrymandering back to Patrick Henry, actually, in 1788. He actually tries to, am I allowed to say Ratf? He actually tries to screw James Madison out of a seat in the very first Congress back in 1788. It takes its name from the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, in 1812, whose party tries to draw these districts around Boston, the state senate districts, and a political cartoonist says they look like a salamander, so he goes down in infamy as the creator of the gerrymander. So it's been with us for a long time, but it's never been quite so deadly. I mean, think back, even in 1990, even in 2000, when politicians were redrawing these maps, they were essentially still using maps and magic marker and parchment paper. I think back to the way you texted back in 2000. You know, every single button on your phone corresponded to, 4 different letters, and you had to push one and wait for the next letter to come up. So map-making software gets so durable and so technologically precise. The kind of information that is available on all of us, whether it is through the census or whether it is through private channels based on the things you buy, a cloud's worth of consumer preferences, all of the public records that are out there, all of your voting records, which elections you vote in, then cross-tabulated with actual down-ballot precinct results, social media likes. So all of these things are available to map makers. They can be neatly uploaded onto these computers. And when they draw these district lines that look so funny that we laugh at, that we see a Rorschach test in for You know, that's Donald Duck kicking Goofy. All of that is true, but the map makers know precisely what they are doing. They know who lives on which side of those lines. And what we have seen this decade is that there's no longer any swing in our swing districts. We really don't have any left anymore. We're down to maybe 30 out of 435 districts that are still actually considered competitive U.S. House districts. That's a pretty dangerous thing. I mean, again, Democrats get 1.4 million more votes in 2012. Republicans hold the chamber. And if you look at this at a state level, I mean, Pennsylvania, 13 Republicans, 5 Democrats in a largely blue state. Michigan, a 9-5 Republican in a largely blue state. Ohio, 12-4, and this is the great, bellwether split in the country. North Carolina, a 10-3, and no districts have gone in any direction this decade on these maps. So folks who are looking at 2018 and saying, well, the Democrats will take back the House, this is a firewall. And what is so dangerous about gerrymandering is that it creates a firewall. It creates uncompetitive districts in which politicians are responsive only to the extreme in their parties. It makes us more polarized. It makes our politics more dysfunctional, and it takes the power away from us as voters to do anything about it.
Can I ask a question? Isn't this directly related today to the technological advances in marketing? And isn't this a kind of marketing in a way? The algorithms of prior purchases predict our forthcoming likely purchases, and so we get identified early on before we've made that purchase and targeted very specifically. Is this any different from that in a political arena?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the same algorithms that tell you what you would like to buy on Amazon or what you want to watch next on Netflix are the same algorithms that are being used by map makers, only they have a lot more information. They've got the entire census at their disposal, and they've got voting records going down ballot for a long time. And they are able to work with and refine these maps and just perfect them so that they are really unbeatable. And it takes the idea of representative democracy and it perverts it wildly. It takes results out of our hands, it makes our elections uncompetitive, and it makes our votes not count.
Let me tell you why I like this in Moscow. Okay? You said it empowers the more radical elements, the fringe elements in both parties. Now, how can I accelerate that process and make that process larger and bigger? Well, you got some of these great technological tools, and I can have some of my people, pretending to be other people, buy some advertisements. And I can make them very extreme. I can give them good American names. And I can appeal to different groups. I can create a user by the name of Activist, or I can create another one called Heart of Texas, or I can create another one called Secure Borders. And do you know what I can do? I can put radical content out there. And once I have the content out on Facebook, anybody who likes it, it's going to go to all of their friends, and it's going to spread and spread and spread. It probably doesn't cost me a whole lot of money to do this, but I can take advantage of the situation the Americans have created. Thank you.
But does it work?
That's an interesting question. And related to that question, let me just say, by the way, and since I'm not an English professor, I can say this expression. You guys are making me nervouser and nervouser, okay? But let's continue on that path. What the heck is fake news, and why does it matter? Okay, and I think across the board, and there's a Russian element to here, yes, but there's a lot more than a Russian element, I think, to the issue of what fake news is and the impact it's having.
Well, I mean, fake news, no matter what you call it, today it's fake news, yesterday it might have been propaganda, phony. I know there was some discussion last night about this being called atrocity propaganda. I'd just like to take it back again to the Iraq War, where the United States were the main purveyors of fake news. I don't know if many of you remember this because it wasn't highly reported, but the military had spent over $500 million hiring defense contractors to create fake news for Iraq. And so basically there were two strands to this. One, they were creating fake news stories, working with Iraqi journalists and paying them money to write stories from the United States point of view to insert into local Iraqi newspapers about how great the Americans were, how great this invasion was, that they deposed Saddam Hussein, how the reconstruction was going. Everything was, unicorns and rainbows, and your taxpayer money was being used for this. Was it successful? I don't think so. We look at Iraq today and realize what a mess it is. So we can't really measure how successful those interventions were, but it was fake news, and you paid for it. The other strand were videos that were made they were anti-Al-Qaeda videos that were made, or actually, no, I'll take it back. They were pro-Al-Qaeda videos that were made by the United States that were thrown up on social media. And so when people that were sympathetic to terrorists and Al-Qaeda, ISIS, maybe this was pre-ISIS at the time, would view it, the CIA had a way to track who was looking at these videos so they could keep an eye on them. That's fake news. So the whole idea that the Russians have been exploiting our big tech to involve themselves or to persuade or sway the election is not new. We've been doing it for years, and I'm only going back 15 years now, so.
Let me try to, I'm not Vlad, by the way, now. Now I'm Jim, retired CIA, 30-year career guy.
Sure you are.
We talk later. So propaganda. Propaganda is a tool of foreign policy. It falls into a larger category called covert action. If you think about instruments of national power, you have diplomacy at one end, you have send in the Marines at the other, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do to promote your policies, and these go in the area of covert action. Covert action ranges from propaganda all the way up to paramilitary. On the propaganda tool itself, there are three generally accepted categories: white propaganda, gray propaganda, and black propaganda. And that has to do with the truthfulness of the information and where the information comes from. White propaganda is simply getting legitimate news organizations to run stories that have no falsehoods in them. Gray propaganda, you take one of those two factors and you make it different. For example, the leaked emails that WikiLeaks put out the night before the Democratic Convention, that was gray propaganda. Those were true emails, but the fact that WikiLeaks put them out, they were probably provided to WikiLeaks by the Russians, and the fact they happened the night before the convention, that's not chance, folks. And then there's purely black propaganda. There's an organization called RT, used to be Russia TV, but now they don't even do that. And by the way, you should check out their website. It's the only news organization that has no advertising on it. Gee, I wonder where they get their money, okay? Well, they put out a very slick video called All the Clinton Organization Money, Bill Clinton's organization, ends up in the Clinton pocketbook. It was viewed 9 million times by Americans, okay? That's black propaganda. Now, are these tools new? No. Sun Tzu talks about propaganda in The Art of War in 500 BC, okay? So saying that propaganda is a bad thing, it should not be used, it's not a legitimate tool, you could say that about military force. Military force should never be used. People get killed. For God's sake, that's worse than propaganda. No, I'm not saying get rid of these tools, but also don't draw moral equivalence, okay? When the U.S. engages in these activities, the reason it does so, at least until recently, was to promote democracy and promote the free market system. And That's the
So why
post-World
didn't
War
it use its
II.
own reporters to put the stories out? Why did it have to hire Iraqi reporters to put their stories out?
Because if you want to be
Why the
more
subterfuge?
effective, I'm not saying who did what, but you use foreigners because to give it legitimacy, it's more legitimate if it comes from someone else, just like the Russians used WikiLeaks, okay? So I just want to clarify that covert action, propaganda, is a legitimate tool of national power. Now, that being said, when you catch someone doing something to you, you should have a robust response. Just as when the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor using the military tool, we went back at them gangbusters. And the fact is we have gone back against the Russians. Think about this. In this dysfunctional time, where we are so polarized, where Congress can't get anything done, they got one thing done. The sanctions bill against Russia, what was the vote in the Senate? 97 to 2, 98 to 2? What was the vote in the House? 393 to 3. The one thing our legislators could agree to was the Russians did have an impact, they were fooling inside of our system, and we don't want it to happen again.
David Russell?
But I don't have any strong views on it.
The call is coming from inside the House. This is a pretty political audience. You're all willing to be here to listen to us at 9:30 on a Saturday morning. I'm curious, a show of hands, how many people in this room have heard of something called the Red Map? Red Map. It's about 4 or 5. Okay. I would say that fake news might be a problem, but I also might say that real news is a problem if we don't know and if our press is not accurately covering what our own political parties are doing to harm our own democracy. A red map is something called the Redistricting Majority Project, and this is the brainchild of Karl Rove, of Ed Gillespie, of a really smart strategist named Chris Jankowski, at something called the Republican State Leadership Committee, and these are the people who, after the election in 2008, realized that the Republicans can plot their strategy back to power through redistricting. And their fight becomes, let's look at all of the state capitals where this act of drawing districts is done, and let's be sure that we as Republicans control every seat at the table when redistricting is done. So they do this by, in 2010, focusing very intently on state legislative chambers, especially in blue states and in purple states, and in trying to have complete control of the districting process in all of these states. Karl Rove writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he says, if we can flip 107 state legislative seats in 16 states, we will have the power to draw on our own nearly 190 of the 435 US House districts. They execute this plan so perfectly, at first that very few of us even knew that they were up to this or have learned in the 6 years since then that they pulled this off. But they pull it off so perfectly for $30 million. It's the greatest political heist in American politics. It's essentially Moneyball for politics, if you saw the Brad Pitt movie or read the Michael Lewis bestseller. And by taking over these legislative chambers, they actually are able to draw 193 of the 435 districts completely on their own. Democrats have the ability to draw only 44 on their own. So I think sometimes when we're talking about fake news, we also have to be talking about poor quality news. And so much of what we're given frames redistricting and gerrymandering as just something that politicians do, or it's just sort of part of the system. It changed in 2010. Gerrymandering from 1790 through 2000 is in its minor leagues. It jumped straight into its steroids era in 2010. We have to talk about it as what it is, a real, true threat to the idea of competitive representative democracy.
So what you're saying, Dave, is that when we should be talking more about gerrymandering as the conditions that led to the loss for the Democrats in this presidential election, we're being distracted by this other narrative, which may not have had as much of an impact on the results of the election.
Yes, I think that in a race this close, as my close friend Vladimir said, just about anything can be decisive. But I mean, Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. Trump takes the Electoral College by 80,000 votes in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, 3 of the most gerrymandered states in the country. And the first thing that these gerrymandered state legislatures do after they take power is they go after voting rights. So the kind of voter ID bills, the kind of voter suppression bills, the kinds of things that the Trump administration and the Kobach-Pence, the panel on electoral integrity, are trying to do right now involving national voter ID bills and cross-check and trying to knock names off of lists. They did this in all of these states to huge effect. There have been studies out of Wisconsin where the margin was 20,000 votes that, I mean, upwards of a couple 100,000 people did not have the right to vote in that election that should have. So this is a hugely important issue, I would say.
Working here, I'll try yours. A point you make in passing, too, is, and it's related to what Kelley was saying, is very important as a corollary to this, is what we do get for news and what we do pay attention to and what comes into our homes every night on the 6 o'clock news. I mean, the fact that you're pointing out there are 12 purveyors of and controllers of the news that we do get. And that narrative is in a way, a dominant narrative. It overrides the underlying reality that you're describing, Dave.
Okay, so 2 things. One is, let's remember, hold not on the white thing at the bottom.
Okay, now, thank you.
Second. Second, I want to expand on this. So, why do the American people not care about gerrymandering? Because they don't seem to care, and the news media doesn't really seem to care. We hear a lot about other stuff. How many people here in the last 3 months have heard anything more than 1 article about gerrymandering?
Only because it's in this.
No, but even still, there are lots and lots of people who aren't raising their hands. What's going on that these issues are not, we're not thinking about them, we're not worried about them?
Maybe that story doesn't sell. I mean, if you want to look at it as a purely, from a pure big media, modern media point of view, it's not sexy enough. It's complicated. It forces you to think. It forces you to think about who the masterminds are, how they did it, technology, maps, Supreme Court cases, you know. And I think the big media, the 12 that I had described, recognize that we have American people supposedly have very short attention spans, and they're not interested. It doesn't push any cultural identity buttons or any of the prevailing issues that trigger people today, and they just have sidelined it. I agree with you. I know about gerrymandering. I'm interested in it. I realize it's an issue, but until I read articles that Dave had written recently and then started paying attention to the Supreme Court case, I had no idea how bad the issue is. And if I'm just thinking how many more Americans aren't even aware at the even simplest level.
It only, in a way, I am holding it the way I'm supposed to, and it's still not working. I almost forgot what I was going to say. It only reinforces our sense of helplessness in a way. And I think as a nation, we've come to feel, most of us, so helpless and out of control of our lives, that this is another way for us not to feel in control. And I think we just avert gaze as a result.
I would agree. Yes. I mean, I think that's certainly the case. On the other hand, I feel like I walk around with a black cloud over my head often. So, I mean, I will say this, that I think that since last November, I think that there is more awareness of this than ever. I think people understand more about how lines matter, how when you draw the lines, you make the rules, that even though we think the side with the most votes wins, that the power to district also brings with it the power to pick winners and losers. I think we are looking at a closely divided country and saying, wait a second, why is all the political power over here? Why aren't these races going to flip? I think as we head towards the 2018 midterms, there's going to be an awful lot of conversation about this. Are the Democrats able to take back the House of Representatives? If there is a wave in their direction, or will the structural problems be so severe that a popular majority is once again thwarted as it was in 2012? And I think not speaking as a partisan, speaking as someone who believes deeply in the value of representative democracy, and that the side with the most votes ought to win, I think matters very much. There was one word in 2016 that united Trump voters and Sanders voters, and that word was rigged. The system is rigged. It's a powerful word, and I think it's an accurate critique in very many ways. I think politicians count on the fact that this seems arcane, it seems boring, it seems technical, it's math. In reality, these lines are the building blocks of our democracy, and when they get twisted, our democracy gets twisted deeply along with it.
Could you talk a little bit, too, about the implications of this for potential constitutional amendments?
You are really trying to bring out the black cloud over my head, Vladimir.
That's what he specializes in.
Well, we are not far from Republicans having control of enough state legislatures in the country to force a new constitutional convention. And this sounds like I'm a crazy person up here talking about this, but I believe you need 37 for that to happen, 38. There are 35. I mean, in the last week, you've had the president tweeting about the First Amendment. Do we think if there was a new constitutional convention led by the crowds that control these legislatures that we would have the same First Amendment? I don't know that we would. You have seen in a lot of these gerrymandered states attempts to end the direct election of U.S. senators. Would we still have a 19th Amendment? We have seen the actions that these gerrymandered state legislatures have taken on voting rights. Who would still have the right to vote in this country if we had another constitutional convention led by the people who are willing to make these kinds of choices and push these kinds of bills and enact them in states like North Carolina and Texas and Michigan and Ohio? So I don't mean to be the voice of doom, but we are in a serious and chilling moment.
To build on serious and chilling, in addition to gerrymandering, what do you think is an essential threat to our democracy in terms of how politics and politics in the news are currently interacting? And we are getting back to Russia, Vladimir, I promise. But right now, what are we facing in addition to a very, as David, as you pointed out, I mean, this was intentional, it was plotted, it was careful, and it's having a very large impact on our politics. And parenthetically, I teach a bunch of 18 to 21-year-olds, and the vast majority of them have never heard of gerrymandering at all.
I'll come talk about it.
Okay. We may arrange that, right? But really, they don't hear about it. They hear about Russian intervention. They hear about how horrible this candidate is or that candidate is. But in terms of this stuff, they're not hearing about it. But in addition to the gerrymandering, from your different perspectives, what are other large threats we face to American democracy today within the context of these technological and corporate and so forth issues?
Let me do Vladimir here, but just to get to your question. What Vladimir sees as opportunities, we domestically should be seeing as weaknesses.
By the way, did you get a lot of money to fly from Russia to be here for today?
First class.
What's the honorarium?
First class. But I want to pick up on your point. You talk about 12 conglomerates that control the news. And the fact is, it would almost be okay if they knew they were in the news business. But as we've heard over the last couple of days, until just a few weeks ago or days ago, these companies thought of, Google and Facebook thought of themselves as technology companies. And what that means is they own the big pipe, and information flows through that pipe, but they feel no responsibility for what's in that flow. So think about that like your water system, okay? When you go and you turn on the water, you're assuming two things, that water will come out, and secondly, that the water is continually tested and that it's good water and you're not going to get sick. From sitting in Moscow, I see this pipe. They're letting anything go through that pipe we want to go through. It's very simple for me just to add a few other things into that pipe. There's already a bunch of sewage in there. I can just make it a little more dangerous. So, you know, one of my big fears in Moscow is you're going to get control of not just the pipe, but you're going to start putting things around what goes through that pipe.
That's actually a perfect metaphor, because once again, the call is coming from inside the House. I mean, what these legislative chambers do when they are out of whack with the popular will is they do things we don't want, and we can't change it at the ballot box. So look at the state of Michigan for a second. I mean, in Michigan in 2012, in 2014, in 2016, Democrats have gotten more votes for the state house in that state. They've never once taken control of the chamber. Republicans have a big lead. So in 2010, you get a Republican trifecta in the state, at both houses of the legislature, as well as a Republican governor. And one of the first things they do is enact an emergency manager bill that allows them to take control of the operations of various cities across the state if they so desire. This does not please the voters of Michigan, who put this to an initiative process and beat it. So it's gone. And then this gerrymandered legislature simply puts it right back in place, regardless of the fact that voters took it away. And to bring it back to water, I think we all know what happened in Flint, Michigan, as a result of the gross negligence of the emergency managers. Water became poison, kids died. This is what happens when we take our politics away from the ballot box and insulate politicians to be able to do whatever they want, to pursue whatever kind of agenda they want without concern for the people.
Well, I find one of the biggest dangers, and it's becoming more dangerous, is, like I mentioned before, the consolidation of news power and the demise of local news and newspapers. I worked for a newspaper in New Britain, Connecticut in the 90s, in the early 90s. It had been owned by a family for over 100 years. It was the classic model. There was, I would say, about 4 to 6 beat reporters covering the towns surrounding New Britain, the central Connecticut area. You had like 3 or 4 people on the city staff. You had line editors who had been there for 20, 30 years in some regards, and it had gotten sold to a chain of newspapers in '95, and they slashed the staff. The people that were left there were demoralized. The paper shrank. They lost all the local news coverage, brought in a wire service to cover the rest of it, and the rest is history. It looks like every other local newspaper on the East Coast, if they're left anymore. This was 20 years ago. And what we're finding is that the decimation of local newspapers happened in parallel with the rise of the internet and digital media. I work in Washington now. I no longer work for, I work for a magazine that has both a print and a digital side, but most people, journalists I know, work on digital products. And like some 73% of those digital products and the people who work for them exist on the East Coast or the West Coast, you know, around the big cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and a smattering in Chicago and Phoenix, according to some recent statistics that I've seen. So the rest of the country, there's a virtual blackout in terms of the people who are writing for the news and the stories that they're getting. So most Americans are getting this sort of East Coast, West Coast, like myopic or biopic view of what the rest of the country is doing. And I think that we're all suffering from that, because that leaves the messages and the opinion making to a collective few voices, and they're overridingly elite. And they're overridingly coming from Ivy League schools and certain backgrounds that don't reflect the rest of the country. It's not about skin color or even ethnicity, it's about class. And I feel like the country revolted, we saw it in this last election, because they felt like not only were the Washington elites not speaking for them, but the media elites were not speaking for them. They sensed that they weren't being represented. And I think the more that the media is centered in these worlds, and they're only filtered through big media like Facebook and Google, making it even more diffuse and in terms of like what people access. They're only accessing their own echo chambers, that we're going to see this divide continue and this more disconnectedness continue.
A broad cultural sense, though, in the last several decades, really, since the rise of the internet and also the emergence of the merging of all those media outlets into those 12 that you mentioned, has, I think, facilitated and perhaps even created a shift from a sense of ourselves as citizens to a sense of ourselves as consumers, primarily. And that to me is the greatest, the thing I feel most concerned about in our life today, in this nation today, is that instead of being citizens, we've become consumers. And we're reinforced in that shift every moment, every time we go on Facebook, every time we turn on the computer, every time we look at our phone, and our conversations start to evolve around it, and our relationships with each other and the institutions that we've built start to revolve around this shift. So we haven't, as we've been talking about this, we haven't used the word citizen once, and that's kind of surprising when you think about it. Citizen Putin, you must be very grateful for that.
Absolutely.
So, Kelley, I'm going to just make one comment. I agree with everything you just said, with one caveat. I think race and ethnicity and gender are still playing a huge role in all of this in
Right,
terms
but
of who gets access.
But if the news organizations as they exist today are only plucking students who are graduating for Ivy League schools, and they're coming from specific backgrounds, it still has the same effect in terms of their reporting, because they don't have the diversity of coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I don't have statistics on that, so I'm not prepared to argue about it in terms of who's going to these Ivy League schools, who's going into these J schools, and how they're getting into these places. But I find, talking to editors who do hiring, that there is this game in Washington that it's who you know and what school you went to. And a lot of these kids that are coming from these Ivy League schools get much better preference. You know, it's a sad reality. And so what I'm saying is that their backgrounds don't give them the reference points to really talk to the issues that are important to Americans from all over the country, not just from their respective, middle, upper class backgrounds.
Right. I'm agreeing with you. It's just who's feeding into those schools, I think, is key as well.
Yeah.
There is, interestingly, one issue that we really haven't talked about or brought up within the context of this problem. I remember after this past election, we had a meeting of students. Students wanted to have a meeting. They wanted to hear what political scientists thought. That happens very rarely, so we organized a meeting, and we had students. We figured we'd have 40 or 60 students. We had about 120, and people couldn't come into the room. And finally, a lot of talk, and students said, why, what's going on here? Because clearly we don't agree with what's going on here. Why did it happen? And I asked a very simple question, which was, how many of you know somebody who didn't vote? and every single student in that room raised their hand. And we have a huge percentage of Americans who are not voting. How much of this fake news and this rigged nature, you mentioned rigged, how much of that is impacting who's voting and who's not voting and how they're thinking about this?
Yeah, well, that goes back to our sense of ourselves as powerless, as unable to control the forces that are shaping our lives.
We feel powerless, though, because in many ways we are. Most of us live in one of the 45 states that's not actually a swing state, or in one of the 405 of 435 congressional districts that are not swing districts. So our vote in many of those ways has been made not to count. I mean, I was here last night as well, and one of the things I haven't heard anybody exactly say yet is while Donald Trump won the Electoral College, Hillary Clinton got 2.8 million more votes. The Democrats gained seats in the House and gained seats in the Senate. They hold no power. This is a systemic question. This is a question of election rules and structures and how we vote, and it's a question that goes back to, at its root, how these districts are drawn, who is then elected to represent us, and then what they feel empowered to do while being essentially insulated from being defeated, even if 2.8 million more of us are on the other side. It's a very dangerous situation. And if you, just very quickly to answer your question about who doesn't vote, we know what the impact of these voter ID bills are. It dampens Democratic turnout, according to a study by the University of California, San Diego, by 7.7%. It doubles the participation gap between whites and African Americans and between whites and Latinos. And it hits very hard at folks between 18 and 34. And this is because these state legislatures know how to craft these bills in such a way as to target these people. So they go after college students. So they say, you can't register to vote and prove you live here with a school ID, but if you have a gun ID in the state of Texas, that's perfectly fine. In North Carolina, they surgically targeted the kinds of identification cards that African Americans were least likely to have. They actually did a study of the kinds of identification that African Americans did not have, and then they require those. So when you see this kind of drop-off, and when you see elections that are as close as this, and when you see participation numbers dwindling, this is not a coincidence.
Vladimir or Kelley?
Well, let me start as Jim, and then I'll go to Vladimir.
Although I have to note, I just have to say, Vladimir, that David is succeeding in being more depressing than you are.
Let me try to change that if I can. First, I just want to emphasize again that everything that we're talking about here, with the exception of Vladimir, we are doing to ourselves, or we have allowed to be done to ourselves. The reason I go into Vladimir is because Vladimir is when another country is doing it to us. And I want to agree with you that we need to look at all these things we're doing to us. I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and also look at what Vladimir has done to us. So let me go back to Vladimir. Vladimir looks at the very issues you're talking about here and says, how can I use these systemic characteristics in the U.S. to advance my agenda? So to understand what he's going to do, you have to understand his agenda. And I started out talking a little bit about, how I grew up in the KGB and, how what happened to my Soviet Union's horrendous and how the U.S. shamed us. So what are my goals? First and foremost, my goal is to destroy NATO. okay? It's a long path. I can't go there directly. That is the military alliance. I feel encircled by them. But anything I can do to weaken or get rid of NATO is first. Second, I want to weaken the EU because I want to be the power center in that part of the world. I don't want the EU to be there. Third, I want to discredit Western liberal democratic systems. I want to emphasize the very things David's talking about here, that you can't trust democracy because in democracy, you know, this small group will take over. So those are my end goals. How can I achieve those goals at lowest cost? Okay, I'm going to use the technology that's out there now. I talked about the big pipe and no one's checking the water, so I'm going to put my message into the water. I'm going to find a variety of these technological solutions. And if you want to see a litany of those, we had a very rare occurrence back in January when the CIA, NSA, the Director of National Intelligence, and the FBI put out an intelligence report. And I can tell you from almost 50 years in this business, that is a legitimate intelligence report. The only thing they've done is strip out the really sensitive material. The evidence, because if you give you the evidence, then you're going to know how we got it. But you know, you can take it or not. But you folks spend $75 billion a year on intelligence, so I would think you might want to take a look at this because it's going to show you how I go about doing it, both getting into systems and using things like RT. But my key question for Vlad is, Vlad, how much are you going to spend to make this happen? And you answer this question. Did I do a $2 million program, a $20 million program, or a $200 million program?
All I've seen is that you spent $100,000 on Facebook advertising. So
Okay.
I don't know what the numbers are.
Ah, that's the key. You don't know. I don't know. You folks don't know. Why the hell don't we know? Now it's my turn to beat up on the intelligence community. I know the agency well enough to know that they captured the vast majority of the physicals. Very good at collecting specifics. Why can't you take those specifics and put a price tag on them? I talked about the RT video about Clinton. It got 9 million hits. You folks could tell me what it costs to create a video like that. You know, I'm going to react differently if Vlad only did a $2 million program to if Vlad spent $200 million. And the fact is, we cannot answer that question. And part of the reason we can't answer it is the way we have structured our intelligence organizations. The CIA is not going to tell you the impact on the U.S. election. That's not in their writ. They can collect information on what the Russians did. Are you going to trust DHS intel to tell you the impact? I wouldn't count
Not
on it.
really, because they were wrong about the Russians' involvement in hacking voter systems in the states. They said 21 states had been hacked, and then they had to come out and retract half the story. So no, I don't trust DHS.
Well, they don't have the horses, to be very candid, okay? But that would be one thing I think we as Americans could demand to know is how big was this effort? I want a level of effort. I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to get the impact. But by the way, the impact is not just making voting machines not work right, but rather it is either demoralizing people so they don't vote, or getting them to vote for a particular candidate. And if you go through the materials Russians have put out, there's nothing anti-Trump in any of their materials. It's all about Hillary. So this is where I'm sitting in Moscow. I was successful in getting my candidate to win, but you know what? I'm beginning to wonder if it was worth the cost. Because first of all, there's a lot of blowback. You know, covert action is successful when the people it's being pulled on don't know that I'm doing it to you, okay? We know Vladimir did it. So in a technical sense, he was not successful, but his candidate did win. But I got to tell you, sitting in Moscow and looking at North Korea and thinking about this, I almost used a bad term, person in the White House, I'm not sure that I did the right thing getting him there.
I do have a question for the panel, because this, and this is just, it's bugging me ever since we sat down and Dave started talking about the gerrymandering. Why is it that the Democrats have spent so much energy on this Russia story as a reason for their loss? And that includes, pushing the matter in Congress, helping leak, stories to the media, which is pretty complicit, and pushing this narrative. They've made it all about the Russians. Why aren't they spending all of their energy and resources tearing down this structure, helping to say the next time we have an election, we're going to make sure that we put an end to this process that the Republicans have hijacked? It would seem to me that even if they were successful in delegitimizing Trump, even impeaching him, that there would still be this problem in the states, but they seem to be ignoring it themselves. And I'm just wondering what's in it for them to distract us in such a way.
Let me make a quick comment on that. The first one is, if it can be demonstrated that the Trump campaign actively worked with the Russians to target that effort, I think you're either talking impeachment or 25th Amendment, because it's of a different character, because it's something foreigners did to us. So it makes it an obvious thing to look at. Also, I think there's enough information there that you got that vote on sanctions the way you did. So I think the Republicans agree with the Democrats that the Russians were actively involved. They might not agree on the impact, but that they were involved. As far as working on the internals, I would ask you that same question for the Republicans, because next time they may go after them.
Right, but let's just go, I would like to just go to vote for a sec, the vote. I mean, if you look at who's voting, you have Democrats who are convinced that the Russians meddled and helped elect Donald Trump, and the Republicans, by and large, don't like the Russians. I mean, remember the debate under the Obama administration where John McCain and Lindsey Graham came out and were taunting Obama for not arming the Ukrainians. So there's no contingency in the Congress right now. There's no pro-Russian contingency. I mean, you have smatterings like Dana Rohrabacher, for example, who maybe voted against those sanctions, I don't know. But I think that was an easy get, just because there's just no pro-Russians in the Congress right now. They might have differing opinions on the meddling.
So so two things. First of all, Vlad, you asked the question of yourself that I was planning to ask, so congratulations. And Kelley, you also asked a question I had on the table. So if anybody else would like to answer, I think it's a very important question.
It is a really important question. And I would agree that the idea that Putin has masterminded everything has become a convenient scapegoat in many ways in democratic circles. I think some of this could well be true, and yet could still also perhaps be overwhelmingly being used by Democrats. I mean, and also by the news media in some ways. There have been it's not just the story this week about the 21 states where election machines were hacked and then weren't hacked. I mean, there's the Washington Post story about the Vermont electricity plant that the Russians hacked. There was, and that story had to get essentially, it walked all the way back. There's the story in Fortune that RT took over C-SPAN. That had to be retracted. The Washington Post story about Russia being behind fake news sites, and then the main fake news sites that they were citing were essentially the Drudge Report and a whole bunch of kind of left-wing sites. And 200 million people read and saw that story. And we were talking about the economics of the news business. 200 million people in a story that goes viral brings you a lot of money, it brings you a lot of attention, it brings you a lot of TV appearances, and all of those things matter in this media ecosystem. And by blaming things on Russia that they have then had to sort of walk back and say are not Russia, they already collected those clicks, and they know it works for next time, and that they've made their money off those stories. And it's kind of the way that we consume media and share media via Facebook, via all of these things. I do think that there's a danger there that perhaps when we actually do get the actual information on what happened, that we may not believe it.
And also,
you know, yeah.
with our intense focus on Russia, we're forgetting the fact that it's the internet and our dependency on it that makes us so vulnerable. And today it's Russia. Well, it might next election, it might be China, it might be North Korea, it might be Israel. There are all kinds of ways to control and manipulate our elections by lots of people with interests that parallel Putin's interests.
And the Democrats are trying, to answer the second part of your question, they are attempting now to sort of awaken from their slumber in 2010 when they just like didn't get the Wall Street Journal that day, that, you know, Karl Rove's piece laying out the entire plan is right there in the paper. And so Barack Obama and Eric Holder are running something called the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, and they're trying to raise upwards of $200 million to put into this strategy in 2018 and 2020 to try and flip legislative chambers back in their direction. They've got another $200 million that's coming from unions and educational associations and other kind of related Democratic groups. Republicans are running Red Map 2020, and they've also got something called the National Republican Redistricting Trust, which is going to raise another $200 million. So in some ways, everybody has woken up to the fact that 2020 is a redistricting year and that this is going to be the fight. On the other hand, we're talking about almost $1 billion being dumped into our state legislative elections that's essentially going to be nasty negative ads. And is this what we want our politics to be? Do we want our state and local elections to be turned into a decennial referendum on redistricting? We have got to take control of this process, take it out of the politicians' hands, put it back in our own hands. We are the only democracy in the world that allows politicians to draw their own lines and choose their own voters. And until we fix that, we, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, are not going to have our country.
Where do you think the Supreme Court's going to go on this?
It's all up to Anthony Kennedy, right? I was in the court for the hearing last week, and it is it's a 4-4 court. Kennedy, 12 years ago, the last time the court took up partisan gerrymandering, expressed his interest in this, but he wanted a technical standard that could explain when a gerrymander took place. So this, a case out of Wisconsin, which arises out of the maps that were drawn in 2012. Republicans won 174,000 fewer votes, but controlled the chambers 60-39, nevertheless, and that hasn't changed all decade. So that's the battleground of this case, and you have 4 conservative justices on one side who are saying that partisan gerrymandering has always been part of the process, and it's just fine. You have 4 liberals on the other hand who are saying this is kind of a problem, we'd like to do something about it. And you've got Kennedy in the middle, who is as inscrutable to me as ever.
Well, at some point we're going to find out what inscrutability is, and then that could have huge impact. I would like to note one thing, and then I want to move back to the Russians, because, Vlad, I don't want you to be ignored. What? Questions? Okay. I thought we had till 11:10 we started questions.
No, that's the end.
Oh, I apologize. We're going to stop right now. And no, for questions. My apologies. Yes, questions.
I think that's a good sign, don't you? Maybe not. That's a sign. We're in for it.
Okay.
I'm redrawing the lines. The line is longer on this side than on this side, so it's gerrymandered over here, folks. So you've got a better chance on this side.
Go ahead.
You painted a horrifying picture from gerrymandering and its impact on what we call our so-called democracy. How do we fight back as a people, as a citizen? Is it too late? And what do we do? I mean, it's,
That's a happy question.
This case that is at the Supreme Court is there because a dozen retirees started meeting in a Milwaukee tea room, and they started talking about what had happened to their state, and they started plotting a legal strategy, and now it's at the Supreme Court with the possibility to transform our democracy and to give us the first ever standard on partisan gerrymandering. That is a huge deal. So the idea that we can't do anything about this is wrong. First, we have to be really aware of it. Politicians, like I said earlier, thrive on the fact that we think this is boring, that it makes our eyes glaze over, that it put us to sleep in 8th grade civics class, if we still even have 8th grade civics class. And they take advantage of that. And they do this in secret and they get away with it. So the more we talk about it, the more we are aware of this, the more we bring it out into the sunlight, the better off we are. There are real solutions that are out there, and there are a lot of groups in a lot of states that are working really hard on this. Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, all of these states are having huge anti-gerrymandering rallies. It's kind of amazing. I mean, I had to call this book a vile word that my mom doesn't know I have a book out. Because people thought that, gerrymandering was something boring and that I wasn't allowed to even have it in the title of the book. I think if this book came out now, people are much more aware of this. They're much more angry. They are beginning to take steps and fight back. I also think we ought to be open to more elaborate kinds of structural electoral reform, things like ranked choice voting, things like multi-member districts, things that take the power and the extremism out of our politics and put the power back in the hands of the people.
Thank you. Next question over here on this side.
Let me preface this by saying that I was a Republican all of my life until this year when I switched. Listening to this conversation, I get the impression from it that everything would be solved if only the Democrats could somehow get back in power. But what I see is a nation that is deeply and bitterly polarized politically. It's a tribal effect. And whichever party is in power, half of the country is going to be against them and is going to see them as illegitimate, and it makes for a paralysis in governance, especially with our system of checks and balances. So how do we deal with that deep polarization problem? My question.
Okay.
I think you're absolutely right about the polarization problem. And I'm not trying to say that everything is perfect the other way. What I'm trying to argue for is that in a representative democracy, the side with the most votes ought to carry the day, and that you have a little bit over 50% on one side, a little under that on the other, but you've got 70% of the political power in our states on the Republican side, and all of the political power in Washington. So things have become asymmetric. No matter how polarized we are, the problem is our elections no longer swing one way to the other when there's a change in public opinion. They've become, in a way, completely immune from public opinion. I mean, our Republicans should have taken control in 2010 when they won big. Democrats should have taken it back in 2012. Republicans in 2014, and probably Democrats again in 2016. But there's no swing left. I mean, all of this polarization matters, and it makes it easier to carve us up and divide us. But what we have to solve is this question of representation, and I think it's a huge problem, and it's something that the ranked choice voting and multi-member districts actually, helps with. You have, I live in Massachusetts, where the congressional delegation is entirely Democrats. You have a lot of Republicans in that state. They essentially don't have a voice in that congressional delegation. If we had a different way of electing these people, you would have more people who felt like they had a voice. If we had fairer elections and fairer districts, I think it goes a long way towards fixing our polarization problem.
Kelley?
Just very shortly, I also think, aside from those issues, that the market forces in play here ensure that we are divided into a two-party system. So whatever impulses there are for third parties, independent parties, are all sidelined by the time we get to these major elections, so we all have to choose sides. And often, some of us independent thinkers, I work for a magazine, its very founding was in 2002 in opposition to the Iraq war policy. We're conservatives. We were called traitors. We were called not patriotic by Republicans and conservatives because we didn't fit into their tiny little box. And I feel like Americans are forced into these tiny little two-party boxes so that we're constantly fighting each other and there's no room for independent thought whatsoever. So if we could find a way to encourage third-party and independent parties, I think that we'd be better off, but as we can hear that the process is just, it's all lined up against it.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up. Oh, keep it going? Oh, okay. Ask your questions quickly, and let's keep it going.
I'm somewhat surprised that over 3 programs, I don't think I've heard the Citizens United court case and decision mentioned comments on its role in attack on truth and these dirty deeds.
Yeah, actually, I was going to mention, apropos of your response to the question, and yours too, Kelley. I mean, if we could block the big money from campaigns, it would alter the field enormously, and it would take this two-party system to task for the polarization in a serious and meaningful way.
Right. I mean, down in Washington, this is just a tiny example, but if you want to, say you want to start a think tank, a nonprofit, advocacy, I was, flirting with starting a anti-war, non-interventionism think tank several years ago. Well, the money only flows right or left. Right. And what we were trying to do was try to bring left and right together. And there were no outlets. No one was going to fund this little fledgling think tank that didn't have a skin in the game on either side. And that's how Washington is set up. So all the money that's flowing is basically serving to maintain this dichotomy, this opposing.
Yeah, on both sides. I mean, it goes both
sides.
Yeah, I want to just stress on that issue of both sides. Up until 2010, the Democrats have definitely benefited from gerrymandering and other kinds of components also. And so both parties have interest in keeping it be only both parties. And that interest is a serious problem.
Democrats have done an awful lot of gerrymandering over the years. In California in the 80s, Texas in the 90s. You can trace it back for a long, long time. I think that the technological nature of the 2010 gerrymander is a little different, but there is not a party that doesn't, have blood on their hands here. Citizens United is extraordinarily important. It's no coincidence that that comes down in January 2010, just as the Republicans are trying to fund the Red Map effort. I mean, Red Map only cost them $30 million, which is chump change for these folks. But I mean, in the book, I try to sort of track where all this money comes from, and it is almost impossible to track it because of what Citizens United did. So our elections have been warped for this entire decade, and we don't know who paid for it.
I wonder if any of you have heard of or done any research on, I'm not getting the title exactly right, the National Voter Compact, and there's another term in there, but basically it looks at the Electoral College on a state-by-state basis, and each state's governor, I believe, has the right to say, whoever wins the popular vote in my state gets all the electoral votes. And this was touted particularly after, as people talked about last night, after the quashing of Sanders in media coverage and elsewhere. This has been touted as a way to not abolish the Electoral College, because we can't, but to very neatly and legally sidestep it and at least give the presidency to the one who won the most popular votes.
There was a lot of energy heading towards this before 2016, and I think 2016 put it right back in the old red versus blue argument again. You had a lot of states, and it was state legislatures that had to pass this and, and join that compact. And if you had enough of them that was over 270, it would essentially go into effect. And it lost all momentum after the 2016 election, made the idea of the popular vote a partisan red versus blue fight again. And there were a couple of state legislatures that it was still being considered in after the 2016 election in Oregon and Connecticut, and it just disappeared in those states. I think the chances for it in the short term are probably not so good. It probably took 15 years after the last time this happened for it to seem like more of a small d Democratic issue than a big D Democratic versus Republican issue. And until that changes again, it's probably hard to imagine it happening. The question is, why did it lose its momentum? And I think it's because it became a partisan issue. And for a long time in these states, it was a fairness issue and a democracy issue. So lots of people could get behind it. And after 2016, it just became another partisan issue, kind of, straight into the maw of red versus blue.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Sir?
Thank you. I think my question is directed primarily to Vladimir. Democracy is being challenged in the United States, but it's become a worldwide phenomenon. Democracy is being threatened around the world, and democracy's in retreat. Would you speak to that, and to what extent do you think the Russians are involved internationally?
You make a good point. I started talking a little bit about my goals with regard to NATO and with regard to the EU, and I have taken action in those realms. I was active in Germany. I was active in France. I was active in Austria. And you may not know it, I was actually instrumental in the Brexit vote. The idea here is that I can use these same techniques that I used in the US at relatively low cost to go against all the major Western liberal democracies. I may not win them all, but my peoples, and that is the far right and the far left, the polarizing elements, are doing quite well. Thank you.
So I want to add just one note to that, because this isn't just about Russian intervention. There's a phenomenon going on in the West where the elites and certain ethnic groups and so forth are feeling threatened by changes in those populations, by influx of refugees, and this is a really useful tool for people who are pushing in certain directions politically. And that's part of it. It's being exploited by certain actors, but it's also changes in populations, and the ability to exploit the feeling of threat is a very powerful, fear is a very powerful political tool. Yeah.
My question is about the Sinclair merger that's about to happen. I believe it's called, I can't read this, Sinclair Broadcast Group and the Tribune Media Company, which would make them the largest corporate media company in the country, I believe. And it seems that the FCC is already in their pocket, and that they are purveyors of a great deal of fake news in local markets. How large a threat is that? I mean, to me, it seems almost as big as gerrymandering if that happens, and they can capture 72% of the local market and, influence in ways that are hugely political. So if you could speak to that, I'd love it.
Yeah, I don't know the particulars of that particular deal, but I know that you're correct. The local affiliate media being dominated by these larger groups ensures that you're getting the downslide of the top of the heap's message all the way through to the local markets, where there's like little competition at this point. And we just talked about the local newspapers. When you look at the holdings that these companies have, like Walt Disney and Time Warner and AT&T and so on and so forth, it's not just cable news. It's major newspapers, book publishing, websites, record companies, Hollywood. So it's like this cross-pollination of media, and so they're all able to benefit from each other, from free advertising, from, like, you go on MSNBC at any time and they have the expert on North Korea. Well, that expert just happened to have a book that came out, was published by one of their publishing houses. And so you're seeing this, so you're getting this funnel of information that's very narrow, that's in the special interests of these groups, so you're not getting alternative news. There's great alternative news out there. We were talking about ProPublica last night, we have The Intercept, but these are nibbling at the margins when you consider these giants and how they mold and shape the messages we see every day through all these mediums.
And Sinclair is a deeply right-wing company that really enforces a very hard line on what they publish as far as local editorials, as far as the films that they show are often very political, right on the eve of elections, showing the kind of anti-Clinton films and insisting that all of their affiliates pick it up in local markets. It's a dangerous it's a dangerous merger. I would agree.
So I want to thank the panelists for really interesting and scary comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Words. I also want to remind you, right here at 11:30, race, class, and the future of democracy. But let's once more thank Russell Banks, David Daley, James Steiner, Kelley Vlahos, and Victor Asal.